is, how did we get here? Okay, how did we get to this situation? So it's important to recognize that unlike a lot of times that there's disturbances in the world, there isn't one factor that got us here. There isn't one thing that we can point to and say, oh, the reason why we're having all of this chaos and all of this trouble with Arabs and with the Palestinians is because of this one incident or this one point of contention. That is definitively not true. This was a lot of different catalysts coming together, a lot of different things that led to these problems. Okay, but in order to figure out what it is that got us here,
okay, do you guys want to listen to real?
Why now? Why is it that that now this happened? What changed this month? Why didn't this happen a month ago? Why didn't this happen last year? What is it about right now that created all of these different forms of tension at once? So the first thing a lot of people will look at and say, well, it's Arabs and Palestinians rioting against Israelis and Jews, so therefore it must be part of the overall Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That must be the big catalyst. That must be the big cause as to what's happening. And the answer is that's actually most probably not true. Now, again, this is my opinion. This is my analysis of it, but also based on the experts that I've been reading, that it's not based on just one thing that occurred, and it's not just based on Israel and the Palestinians together. The first thing that happened right away, most recently, is the Palestinian elections. There were supposed to be Palestinian elections, and they got pushed off. The excuse that Mahmoud Abbas, who's been the head of the Palestinian Authority, the president of the Palestinian Authority now for 15 years without elections, and it was supposed to be a 4-year term. He was supposed to have elections 9 years ago and has constantly pushed them off or just not even scheduled them, was the fact that Israel would not allow Palestinians that live in East Jerusalem to vote in the election, to vote in the Palestinian election. Israel's position is that they live in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not Palestinian territory. Palestinians claim that East Jerusalem is theirs, and therefore any Arab, when we're talking about 250,000 Arabs, any Arabs that live there should be able to vote in Palestinian elections. Chances are that wasn't really the issue. The issue that we're finding is that Hamas was, according to polls, was probably going to win the election. And if Hamas was going to win the election, that means that they would be controlling not only Gaza, but they would begin to control this area here, Judea and Samaria, Yehuda and Shomron, and what the world calls the West Bank. So they would begin to have that. By pushing off the elections indefinitely, not that he delayed the elections and the elections are going to happen at some other later period of time, by pushing off the elections indefinitely, Hamas now cannot become have any influence here. It robbed Hamas of the ability of taking over and having power. So now Hamas has to show its influence some other way. That's the first point of tension that's occurring. It's not actually between the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's actually between the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, and Hamas. So that's point number one to keep in mind as to what's different now than a month ago and why this violence happens. Not because of Israel versus Palestinians, but rather internally within the Palestinians. Another factor to keep in mind that's different is that the Palestinians used to be the central cause of the entire Arab world. And they've sort of taken a back seat. The Abraham Accords saw 4 Arab countries normalize relations, make peace, however you want to describe it, with Israel, and simply say that now Palestine isn't really the biggest issue to us. We're not really worried about Palestinians. There are other factors. We have to look at ourselves first. And that worried the Palestinians, because if the Arab world isn't paying attention to them, then really nobody's going to be paying attention to them anymore. So they had to step up and they had to go ahead and show that they are still focused. They have to do something to bring the world in, and we'll explain what that is in a minute. Why the Abraham Accords were signed months ago. So why now? Because we just saw an Arab party in the Israeli Knesset make that same calculation. The Ra'am party, led by Mansour Abbas, no relation to Mahmoud Abbas, made that same calculation and said, we're no longer going to consider Palestinians as our number one cause. We have to look out for ourselves. We have to look out for our issues, what's important to us. and therefore we're going to look at what's good for Israeli Arabs: jobs, economy, our healthcare, right, education for ourselves, getting more civil services from Israel. So now the Palestinians have to do something to force Israeli Arabs to say, no, you know what? Actually, the Palestinians are our biggest issue. Another internal battle is within Hamas itself. There are two leaders of Hamas who, unless you're really reading into Hamas, you're not going to ever have heard of them: Diaf and Sinwar. I might be mispronouncing their names. These are two military leaders within Hamas. And these two people are having an internal struggle over the leadership of Hamas. What's fascinating, you might say, well, come on, that's too deep down into Hamas. If you were on the Temple Mount yesterday, I wasn't there. If you were on the Temple Mount yesterday, or like me, just watched videos about the chants at the Temple Mount, you might imagine the chants at the Temple Mount were like they were on Saturday night, which said "Bomb Tel Aviv." You might imagine that they're pro-Hamas chants or "Kill the Jew" chants. They weren't. The chants were, "We are all Diaf. We are all this leader of Hamas that's trying to take over from Sinwar. He's much more extremist, much more violent, and is calling for much more violence." So this internal Hamas struggle, which has really nothing to do with Israel, is another huge factor. Another factor that's different now than a couple of weeks ago is Ramadan. Ramadan is the holiest period in the Muslim calendar, and Ramadan obviously does not call for violence. But now that we're in Ramadan and towards the last days of Ramadan, tensions are higher. Fundamentalists within the Islamic movement are going to use these holy days as a way of building tension and creating moments of tension that can lead to violence. Traditionally, they've tried to do that. Some years they're successful, and thankfully most years they're not. But when you have a number of different factors together, it's very easy for them to use these last couple of days of Ramadan to stoke the flames of religious fervor and try to get Muslims to act in a violent way, especially on the Temple Mount. And since that began happening, we saw violence a couple of weeks ago at the Damascus Gate, Shar Shechem in Jerusalem's old city. There's been violence, and that was stoked again when Israel shut down Shar Shechem. It shut down Damascus Gate and didn't let the traditional prayers that Muslims have had during Ramadan there. That angered a lot of Muslims. It started violence. Israel then stepped it up a notch by not allowing on Saturday afternoon. It didn't allow Muslims to come down to the Temple Mount, which was a big tradition for them I think it's the 27th day of Ramadan, to come down and spend the night at the Temple Mount, and the Israeli forces would not allow them to. That just raised tensions even more. And lastly, what the world likes to say that this is all about, but it's a complete lie, is a legal battle in a neighborhood of Jerusalem, which is called Sheikh Jarrah. A lot of people like to call it Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood. It's a neighborhood in East Jerusalem, about 20 minutes from where I'm standing. It's a great shortcut away from a busy highway in Israel if you want to cut through things, right across the street from Hebrew University on Mount Scopus. And Sheikh Jarrah is constantly, there are houses under legal battles from them. So that's some of the so these legal battles were coming to a head. There was supposed to be a decision by Israel's Supreme Court about whether or not the Arab families, some of the Arab families that live in these homes, would be evicted or not. And it looked like the decision was that these homes did belong to Jews before 1948, and any Arabs living in them really did not have a right to live in them without the Jewish owner's permission. They were given to them by the Jordanians during the period of time between 1948 and 1967, when Israel didn't control East Jerusalem, and that raised tensions even more. So that's what you're seeing in terms of different factors that occur now that were not occurring earlier. Okay, and that's how we got there. Okay,